Hello, everybody. We'll get started here in just a minute. We're going to let a few of the attendees join, so just stand by. Okay, Laura, looks like we got quite a few joining, so I'll go ahead and turn the program over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And thank you, everyone, for attending today. This is Dykema Drive's third installment of this year's Automotive Trends Report webinar sessions. Today, we're going to be discussing cybersecurity and intellectual property issues in the automotive industry. My name is Laura Bacchus, and I'm the director of Dykema's Automotive Industry Group. Dykema has 140 attorneys or so in its cross-practice full-service industry group, from everything from IP and cybersecurity, which you'll learn about today, from supply chain to litigation to NHTSA assistance, regulatory, and everything in between. If you're here and you would like CLE credit, please follow the instructions on page 2 of the PowerPoint, and you will receive a copy of this deck after the video. Where did this webinar series come from? In 2023, we started a trends report where we interviewed and surveyed the top automotive industry executives, as well as our clients in-house, from OEMs to tier ones to service vendors and everything in between, to get a sense of the top legal issues that the industry was concerned about this year. Click that QR report and you can get a copy of it. But the report has the survey results as well as interesting commentary by our legal team. Your presenters today, first you'll have Dante Stella. Dante is resident in our Detroit, Michigan office and one of the leaders in our cybersecurity and data privacy team. Dante started out, heavy litigation background, the guru on e-discovery and large document collection and production. Over the years, he's really married his cybersecurity, data privacy skills with the litigation skills to advise, every facet of the automotive industry. Next, we have Michelle Mayfield. Michelle Mayfield, superstar associate in our Detroit office as well, has spoken many times on data privacy, including in the automotive industry. After the cybersecurity presentation, we're going to flip to our presentation on intellectual property. We'll have Tom Moga. Tom Moga is a 30-year veteran IP lawyer focusing on the automotive industry, resident in our Bloomfield Hills office. Tom has a strong IP practice and anti-counterfeiting practice for China and Asia generally. And finally, we have Mike Word. Mike is an IP attorney in our Chicago office. Mike's been practicing intellectual property related litigation and advising for many years, including with the automotive industry, new technologies, EAVs, a strong focus on AI as well, and advising of that. For your knowledge and background, Dykema currently has offices throughout the Midwest, Chicago, Michigan, Wisconsin, as well as Minneapolis, throughout Texas, Los Angeles, and then Washington, D.C. And with that, we'll start a presentation. Thank you for attending.
Dante, you're on mute, please. Yeah, here we go.
As I give my best presentations. One of the things that is really great about the survey is kind of getting inside the mind of the industry and understanding where the anxieties are. And based on the survey results this year, there have been quite a few anxieties. So one of the things that we're going to do in this process is go through some of the top concerns and talk about, how do these relate to things that are happening in real life. So when we're going down this list, ransomware and extortion hit the top of the list like they typically do. I mean, this this topic never gets old. The variety of ways in which people get attacked is staggering, and there's always, a new technique. Number two, there's an increased opportunity, and fear about data moving between vehicles and central locations or from vehicle to vehicle. So the data in transit problem. And this mirrors in a lot of ways what happens with networks on the ground, so to speak. So your business networks and general business infrastructures. And number three, is consumer knowledge gaps around cybersecurity threat tactics. Everyone is hearing things about what's going on in the industry with security, what vehicles are monitoring, and are starting to put this together into a comprehensive fear, as are people in the industry, that the security of connected vehicles is becoming more and more of an issue. Rounding out this list are some other topics, all of which relate to the flow of information. So tracking equipment, sometimes used in commercial vehicles, for example, electric charging systems. If you were at our M1 presentation last year, we talked a bit about how the charging infrastructure is getting attacked. There's the industry's continued use of old componentry. I believe it was either the 8086 or the Z80, which finally went out of production. Old legacy chips and systems persist for a really long time in this industry. In terms of in-vehicle attacks, this is a fear that's rising around the application functionality and APIs and all of the things that are connecting to the user experience. And then, as we've seen in the last year, and this has come to pass, is the use of key fobs and interceptions of signals to steal vehicles. So today, we're going to focus on the top three of these because that's about as much time as we'll have to do it. And we'll talk a little bit about what's going on in the world, and you can gauge your own fears and hopes in relation to that. So the number one worry is ransomware and extortion. Needless to say, this is not unique to the auto industry. Anything that is a business can have this problem. But where this is expressing itself most often is at the corporate offices. So in 2023, we still have many of the same top ransomware groups that we've seen in the past. So Lockbit is the industry leader. They had 21% of all of the attacks and 1 in 6 government attacks. Black Hat and Alpha V is another one of note that we'll talk about through this presentation because they have been doing interesting things with extortion. In terms of where the ransomware field is going, ransomware as a service. So the idea of centrally developed software with quote franchising to affiliates is very popular. So this is the way that someone who's good at developing software can collect royalties from attacks. There's been a 76% increase in double extortion, which is where it's not just locking up your system with ransomware, but it's also threatening to expose it on the dark web. There are more cloud attacks. So there are attacks in which people are attacking cloud environments and attacking things that are connected to cloud environments, whether or not they know it. A fourth trend we're seeing is that there's no identifiable malware. So there were a lot more things that depend on intercepting tokens and forging things that do not leave cracks the same way that a piece of malware or computer virus would. And in terms of industry sectors that are getting hit, so technology and manufacturing, which cover the waterfront for automotive, are the number 4 and number 5 sectors for data access brokering. And access is where credentials that have been stolen are bought and sold. We've seen a lot of more combination attacks. So those can be 2 or more types of malware used in the same attack. They can be vulnerabilities in software that no one knows about, so the zero-day attack. And then in some cases, putting things into software, which gets into other software, which gets into a product. And we've seen that in the telecommunications industry. And we think that, that could be a real risk for transportation, given the way that software is stacked on software. If you're a publicly traded company, something to really bear in mind is that Alpha V, one of the top threat groups, filed an SEC complaint last year against one of its own victims, claiming that that victim did not promptly report a material cybersecurity event. Uh, Interestingly, that rule was not yet in place. It was set to go into effect. But the SEC has also taken up prosecutions of CISOs, when there are periodic disclosures or special disclosures that are inaccurate over a long period of time. They've shown a taste for prosecution, and this is a way that having these SEC enforcement things out there has increased the anxiety level with public companies. Another thing that's starting to become the emerging trend is the rise of AI. There are adaptive attacks to defeat adaptive security. AI is getting better at social engineering. So if you have voice print identification via a phone, which a lot of companies are now starting to put in place, deep fake voices can defeat that. There are more and more sophisticated phishing attacks because once you can crunch the way someone sends an email, it becomes easy to replicate it. And then malware can be propagated through ChatGPT, which is something that's been shown in theory. Fortunately, has not come out in the real world in any real way. And we get to the cost of these attacks. So in a large company, the average cost of response, and that's the life cycle cost, is about $4.5 million. So that's gone up. About a third of it could be avoided if you had detailed attention to security and incident response. But most chillingly, only 1 in 3 of these breaches is ID'd by internal means, which means that they're being brought to the attention of companies by the FBI, by incident response vendors who tend to monitor the dark web for stolen data and things like that. So I would say that on that ransomware threat landscape, that your anxieties, as reflected by the survey, are 100% accurate. With that, Michelle will take on some of the good things that have happened.
Yeah, so when it comes to what's happening with ransomware and these type of attacks, the FBI has definitely been putting in a lot of time. They've definitely been booked and busy when it comes to taking down many of these, large ransomware groups. So first they took down Hive, which was a ransomware group that was, taking ransomware from individuals and from companies. So the FBI essentially sat in the servers of this, ransomware group for about 7 months. They generated 300 decryption keys and then gave the keys to the victim so they could unlock their devices without having to pay a specific ransom to the company. And it's projected that, by stopping this particular ransomware group, the operation, they were able to prevent about $130 million in ransomware payments. So that's a really big, significant boost for the FBI. I think another big one was the takedown when the FBI took down this group called Genesis Market. I thought it was interesting because they named the Operation Cookie Monster. I thought that was kind of funny, but it was at the time, it was probably the largest operation because it going after this Russian-linked marketplace where tens of millions of hacked accounts were sold to bad actors around the world. It also included help from the Treasury Department that sanctioned Genesis Market for allegedly stealing and reselling the private information. So it was significant in the sense that this particular group was a major market for stolen credentials. And so it was a major operation, included about 400 law enforcement operations. It was a major operation in that sense. Then you also had the FBI disrupting Lockbit, which was, as Dante said, one of the largest ransomware operations moving forward. They were able to seize public-facing servers and disrupt the ability to publish these threats. What's also interesting as well is that the leader of this organization was recently indicted by a grand jury in the District of New Jersey. Unfortunately, because the individual is overseas, they were not arrested, but they faced 26 counts. And I think the leader is going to be subjected to a series of asset freezes and travel bans moving forward in this matter. And so there's just a ton of the FBI has been really focused on taking out these bad actors, especially since they typically target a lot of victims and organizations, most of which are home-based in the United States. And then when it comes to the next set of data that's addressed, it's definitely the data that's in transit. So based on the results of the survey, this typically focuses on data that hackers siphon off that deals with things in remote access or even data from EV charging stations. So the data that's at issue here is usually focused on diagnostic information, location data, or even personal details such as digital gasoline. And this is definitely very significant when it comes to trucking and commercial vehicle information. So there have been 3 significant commercial vehicle hacks in the past year, one of which took place with Orbcomm. So Orbcomm essentially is a major supplier of electronic logging devices, or ELDs. ELDs are used by truck drivers to record their driving time, to address hours of service, and it also captures the vehicle engine data, movement, and the miles that were driven. And so when this took place in September, truck drivers were essentially forced to notate all of this information by hand. And so this was a major setback for them, especially since the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration takes all that information so they can keep track of all of these records. So they provided all these companies that dealt with this setback with an extension so they can report times for carriers in regards to that. So they had to basically go back to paper, recordings, which was, very significant. Another interesting thing is Reviver. So in California, among other states, they have digital license plates. And so a research team found weaknesses in the software of this process, where they were able to exploit the hacks through the administrative part of it. So essentially, this research team was able to hack into the system overseeing all these digital license plates. They had full administrative access. They could see every detail of every user account, including the vehicle type and address associated with all the vehicles. They could track the vehicles in real time. And they were also able to essentially mark license plates as stolen in real time. So that was a very significant thing. And then another issue that came up with this particular hack is that, or this particular research by the research group, is that they were able to locate and manage all vehicles of a vehicle fleet. And so they could see if the vehicles were dealer vehicles, and then if necessary, get rid of the tags identifying them as such. And then finally, you have this Spyrion fleet, where researchers were able to essentially access a company-wide administrative console for over 15 million vehicles. With the security issues that they identified, they were able to take over any fleet of vehicles, including vehicles that would track and shut off starters for police, ambulance, and law enforcement vehicles, and including, infiltrating the dispatch commands for vehicles for law enforcement and safety purposes. And so these are definitely things that, are definitely significant when it comes to data in transit, and when it comes to the increasing use of, cybersecurity and privacy and connected vehicles with these large fleets. You're still on mute, Dante.
Do this all the time. So moving on to passenger vehicles and building onto a point that Michelle made about Reviver, there are some particularly terrifying aspects for consumers about some of this stuff. Reviver was designed to make it easy for the California DMV to, one, issue license plates and tags, and to make sure that they're authentic, and two, to track stolen vehicles. And one of the things that I read about this is that, when your car is reported as stolen, it comes up, the license plate says stolen. So imagine a prank if you're just driving along the freeway in which you get swatted. So swatting someone is when you call 911 and tell the police that there's a hostage situation, when it's, someone's grandmother, or someone playing a video game. And that type of thing, spills over into the passenger vehicle space, because that type of prank could have really disastrous consequences for motorists. So I mean, that is, even though trucking seems to be the big target, that is a spillover onto the passenger side. So on the passenger side, we are lucky as a society that most vehicle hacks are what we call white hat hackers. So people that are participating in contests and researchers, because the range of things that has come out in passenger vehicle hacks ranges from annoying to terrifying. So for example, the first hackathon that Tesla was involved in, so that would have been last year, or in 2023, There was the winner of the contest managed to remotely connect to a Tesla via Bluetooth, which in itself is really not that exciting because it's designed to connect to things with Bluetooth. But they got control of some of the vehicle systems, some more critical than others. So infotainment, can be an annoyance, can be a problem if you're trying to use the assisted driving functions. The horn can be seriously annoying. A trunk lid can present some safety issues, and wipers also fall into the annoying category. This was a demonstration, and like a lot of things that are shown at these conferences, was corrected very quickly once the mechanism was discovered. But this definitely fits into the novelty category and not so much terror. But when that same group came back to this year's hackathon, they obtained what they call root access to the vehicle's modem. So basically, the transmission and receiving functionality of the car was compromised, which means that you can both hijack telemetry going out and updates and signals coming in. And this type of thing is a more serious type of problem than just firing off the horn randomly. This did require taking 3 previously undocumented vulnerabilities and stringing them together. But this is probably more characteristic of the dangerous type of data interception that can occur. And when you have access to that modem, another thing to bear in mind is that a lot of vehicles transmit real-time location data. And where manufacturers collect that, that could become a security issue if that's compromised. In terms of another one that's going on, SiriusXM has a telematics product, so it has connected car services. It sells this to 16 nameplates, and I think it's 14 OEMs buy it. It's very popular. One of the things that happened with researchers was they managed to get control of lots of different aspects of different vehicles. And this was it did not have the same effect on every single vehicle that it was tried on. Sometimes it was the start-stop functionality. Sometimes it was the locks, sometimes the headlights. But from a privacy perspective, getting control of exact vehicle location, which is regarded as sensitive personal data in every jurisdiction that regulates it, and 360-degree cameras, which raise the possibility of consumer surveillance. It is concerning, although Sirius did close those vulnerabilities fairly quickly. In terms of another thing that is off the road and on the road, some Duke University researchers managed to create a tool that intercepts vehicle radar signals. So how the vehicle sees the environment when there's no visual information available, and managed to mimic the return to signals. So when radar goes out and it hits something, that signal comes back to the vehicle, and it helps identify what it is, how close it is, and how closely you're closing on it. What the Duke researchers managed to do was to simulate those signals so that they could create obstacles that didn't exist or mask obstacles that did. And this is actually particularly of concern for vehicle guidance systems that depend on this type of data, because these phantom objects and non-objects can cause the car to steer around things that aren't there, or steer into things that are there. So this again was a completely theoretical exercise, but this kind of tells you one important thing, which is that it's not just getting access to the vehicle that can cause problems. It can be controlling the vehicle systems without even being inside its security perimeter. So with that, we're going to move on to the third topic, which was knowledge gaps and perceptions among the consumer base. So in looking at the landscape, I'm going to start with the Future of Privacy Forum because it's a good barometer of where the public sees the industry. So the public trusts auto companies more than the government or big technology. I'm not sure whether that's that's something to be proud of, considering the low level of trust in the government and in big technology, but it's something. The public still has concerns that personal data is being collected. They have concerns about the security of vehicles, particularly where they feel like they're not in control. And so this is, from a consumer perception standpoint, and in marketing, the perception is the reality, an issue. Kind of predictably, the Electronic Frontier Foundation has taken up an interest in privacy in vehicles. They published a fairly extensive consumer-facing guide this year on automotive data collection, which lets you even take the VIN number of your vehicle and plug it in and see what capabilities exist and don't. It also provides some instructions on how to control data collection, some of which are based on things that may not be obvious to users, or are in manuals. So it's a mixture. And then Mozilla, had probably the simplest reaction to the auto industry and data privacy and security, which is to call the industry a privacy nightmare on wheels. So that, in terms of the perceptions and institutions and people, is kind of where we are. Where this reached a very concrete result was in recent coverage in the New York Times about LexisNexis and Verisk collecting data from OnStar. So the story was based on the experiences of consumers who found out, when they were trying to decipher their insurance rates, that information had been transmitted from their vehicle and had gotten to LexisNexis and Verisk. This has spawned class action suits already, as one could expect. Fair Credit Reporting Act relating to the insurance piece, deceptive trade practices with regard to privacy policies, and then things like common law invasion of privacy. One of the issues that came out in the New York Times coverage is that there seem to be some indications that dealers have opted consumers in during the car sale process, quote, helping them, input data and check the boxes. So that's something that needs some attention. And then finally, all of this stuff exposes some latent disputes on consents and notices of privacy policies and mobilities. So what is the power of a driver to accept terms for everyone in the car? If you consented when you bought a vehicle, is that good forever? How broad can these consents and notices be? And what is the recourse for someone whose car dealer signed them up? And all of these things will be litigated, I'm sure, because they are contentious issues. A lot of them will be resolved by simple principles of contract law. Some of them will rage on, and there will be some evolution in the industry based on this. And we can expect that some of these issues can actually have the potential to blow back on tech in general, because a lot of these issues are not actually unique to the auto industry, although they're the disputes that come up are based on things that are most obvious in the auto industry. And with that, we'll have Michelle give you a little bit of orientation on where governments are going with this.
Yeah, so just to, I guess, follow up on what Dante was talking about when it comes to the government and political side, as consumers are starting to react, I think the government is starting to find ways to address this issue. So when it comes to, I think, the federal government, Senator Markey, who is a senior senator of the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, has recently sent a letter to the Federal Trade Commission and to automakers expressing his concern about their use of collecting data from vehicles, especially when it comes to vehicle safety, when it comes to collecting location data. There's pressing focus on the use of that data in context of domestic violence, where maybe abusers will want to siphon off that information and use it against their victims. So there's definitely increasing pressure to address the issue in that way, and to even just get more oversight in regards to the automotive industry. Now, it is the Senate, so it's going to take some time to do the hearings and to, investigate. So from the Senate side, at least as far as that particular branch, it may not happen as quickly. However, with the increased pressure from the consumers, there's likely to be more hearings and more focus on that. At the same time, the American Privacy Rights Act was recently proposed this year. It is the federal government's recent attempt to create an overarching federal data privacy statute. Now, there have been other examples where Congress has created such a statute. I think what's significant about this particular one is that both the chairs of the House and Senate committees that oversee this put this together. And in this, world of divided government, you have the Senate chair who's a Democrat and the House chair is a Republican. So because they're working together on this, the fact that this might pass is definitely likely. It's more likely than other, iterations in the past. And going back to what Dante was discussing, the focus is definitely going to be in this bill on creating more general, more like express affirmative consent. So the idea of just, writing in a consent for a party, that's not going to happen anymore. It's definitely focused on creating some sort of express consent where the parties would have to see what they're signing on to. And even along with that, the focus would be on collecting data that's reasonably relevant to the goods, services, or the expected relationship. So there have to be more explanation to the customers and to consumers about how their data is being used and giving them, more of the right to decide how that's going to be moving forward. At the same time, though, states have definitely taken more of the initiative in overseeing and regulating how vehicles are using data and how they're surveilling individuals. So, for instance, California, which is a major state which passed the first comprehensive data privacy law, has passed a law that would address the use and selling videos and photos from vehicles. And so it prohibits, selling these videos and images to third parties. It prohibits, cabin monitoring in vehicle cameras, the use of those. I think the only way outside of getting someone's consent that those can be used is for like access for repairing the vehicle themselves. However, it's important to note that the rights that are given to the user of the vehicle is the driver. It's not extended to the passenger in the vehicle. So those are things that are likely to be, further addressed. Other states like New Jersey have created laws where I think New Jersey has a law where the dealer has to scrub personal information from the vehicle. So they have to offer to delete the consumer information from the vehicle. However, if the consumer can decide not to go with the dealer and they can decide if they want to get rid of the personal information themselves, they are allowed to do so. They would either have to do that themselves or go to a vendor. I know Tennessee and Kentucky have proposed other legislation. And I think other legislation that is dealing with this includes, I think in Tennessee, they've proposed legislation where individuals can opt out of having their personal information collected by dealerships and by car companies. So those things are moving forward. And then New York is also working on legislation to require auto insurers to disclose how they use telematics in regards to addressing, their insurance rates. So how do they, collect the information? How do they use it in regards to determining risk? And that definitely is going to be important, especially with the LexisNexis lawsuits. So then, how does all that work in conjunction to making sure that the automotive rates are what they say they are? Do people have the right to, have certain personal information deleted? All those things are going to come together. So all those things are moving forward. And then finally, the California Privacy Protection Administration, or CPPA, from the California privacy rights bill, they've announced that they're going to start investigating automotive data privacy practices. So, the use of infotainment, collection of vehicle data, collection of personal information, they're going to start moving forward with those collections. So these are definitely things to keep in mind on the state side. So as the federal government's still trying to figure out what's happening, the states are moving forward. So it's likely that the federal government might look to these practices and see if they want to adopt them or if they want to preempt these or just let the states do their own thing. We'll have to watch out and see. And that is it for us on the cybersecurity side.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Dante. I'm Michael Word. I'm in the Chicago office, as Laura mentioned, and along with Tom Moga, we're going to be handling the IP portion of this. I'm going to be handling the U.S. perspective, and Tom's going to be handling the foreign Chinese perspective in particular, which is of increasing importance, as we all know. So let's move to the IP survey results from the survey. You'll see at the top of the list was the potential for increased reliance on AI and AR for vehicle navigation. So, we're going to start with that, and then we'll walk through some of these other survey results and talk about a little bit behind what's motivating some of these numbers and what are some of the concerns. But before we get into that, let's look at some of the overall trends behind these numbers. So the big trend here, as we're probably all aware, is the increasing technology that's being incorporated into vehicles these days, and it's really something of a game of addition and subtraction. By addition, vehicles are borrowing in, so to speak, more and more advanced technologies. And a lot of times this starts as a differentiator, a way for vehicle companies and OEMs and suppliers to, differentiate the product offerings by, including more bells and whistles. But as time goes on and competition increases and consumer demands and expectations change, these become, somewhat standard features. Good example is an infotainment system. It's almost a standard feature these days, and is not it's something that's necessary to compete, not a differentiator. And then on the subtraction side, we have, traditional features that have been disappearing because of advances in technology. The turnkey ignition is disappearing. Stick shift, I hope I'm not dating myself by, mentioning that, and the fact that I still reach down and sometimes go shift my manual or my automatic transmission car. The question is, is the steering wheel the next one to disappear as we move to AVs and more of the ability of the car to control itself. And these rapid innovations and adoptions of technologies, like in other areas, create two significant issues. How do we best identify and protect the IP that's being generated, regardless of whether you're an OEM or supplier? And then how do you best protect against the risk posed by third-party IP as you get into these other technologies? So let's talk about those at a high level. So how do you adapt to these the increased use of technology and the increasing technologies that are coming in? Well, it depends on where you sit, right? And what you're trying to achieve. So for patents typically remain the primary means of protecting IP. For the OEMs, though, the purpose is, typically defensive. But there are some exceptions there. For example, aftermarket sales, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and competition overseas could be changing that perspective as well. The OEMs typically, build these very large patent portfolios to protect their innovations, but it's more of a defensive use. But again, will that change as there's competitors out there or OEMs that don't necessarily abide by the détente and the refusal to enforce against other OEMs. Tier one suppliers and other suppliers, have a different motivation, right? It's not just defensive; it's also offensive. They want to keep out other suppliers and protect their innovations. And so, we need to talk about, with these emerging technologies, are patents still the best way to protect these innovations? We've seen recently the potential rise of trade secrets as a better means of protecting some of these innovations, and that goes to the nature of some of the technologies that are being incorporated. We'll talk about that a little bit more. One of the other questions that keeps coming up and seems to be changing with some of these technologies is who owns them, especially when we're dealing with collaborations between OEMs and suppliers. There's a tension there, and in the past, there's been quite a bit of pressure for the OEM to own the innovation. But is that always the best way to protect things? There's budgetary constraints, and developing IP portfolios, particularly patents, and maintaining them can be an expensive proposition, especially if, as we note above here, OEMs are typically building patent portfolios for defensive purposes. Are there some better opportunities available or options available, I should say, for protecting IP that maybe allow for the supplier to own and to provide the OEM with a license or an exclusive license, given that the tier one suppliers or other suppliers are more likely the ones to assert the patents? And so, is it time to revisit traditional models for IP ownership and protection? The answer is always yes. You should be revisiting this constantly, but because of these emerging technologies, it's more important than ever. And then there's the question of who owns the data. Everyone is a data collector and provider now as these technologies get incorporated into vehicles. Data ownership, the rights to use it, the licenses that go into the data, that becomes a more and more important part of the IP. We're moving away from just patents, right? We're talking about what can be done with the data. So that's an emerging concern as these vehicles become, incorporate more technologies that gather data along with it. So, and then on the other side, we've got protecting against the risk of third-party IP. The more technology that goes into the vehicle, the more risks you have of infringing third-party IP. So the big question becomes, who bears the risk for infringement? And again, there's a tension. Is it the OEM? Is it the supplier? That always needs to be at the forefront of, any transactions that involve emerging technologies. And then once the risk bearer has been decided, how do they address this risk? You should be thinking on the front end, as well as the back end. And obviously, the typical ways to address that risk still apply: freedom to operate, the use of integration of off-the-shelf components versus bespoke components. And then on the back end, there's a number of different options that are available, ranging from patent pools or collective action through industry groups. There's pluses and minuses to each of those. So let's move into some more specific topics. Let's talk about the number one issue in the survey: the potential for increased reliance on AI and AR. So let's start with the risks of third-party IP, and then we can talk about how it affects, or this topic affects changes to protecting IP. So the biggest issue here is really patents, and the patent landmines, so to speak, that are out there. There's an increasing risk of litigation from NPs and patent assertion entities, just based on the numbers. Saw a statistic recently that there's over 67,000 AI companies that are developing IP right now. And a vast majority of them will not survive. And so the question is, what happens to those patents when these companies fail or get acquired? We have potential here for what happened with wireless patents in the wireless industry. The automotive industry got hit very hard with wireless patents and the like from these patent trolls. So is this going to happen with AI and AR as well? We'll talk. Maybe that's the case, but there's reason to believe that that may not be the case, as some of this IP may be more wrapped up in trade secrets as opposed to patents. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then there's the rise of the foreign registrant, and Tom will talk about this a little bit more. But there's China is a leader. If you look at some statistics in terms of the number of patents that are being collected. And then there's other IP that gets involved here beyond patents and trade secrets. The data that's used to train and develop AI models, we've seen that that data and the ownership and the right to use it can give rise to copyright violations or allegations of that. And so that creates a separate risk when we're dealing with AI and AR. So, I know this heading is AI and AR. Everybody's familiar, I would think, about how AI is getting integrated into cars, right? We talk about autonomous driving systems, cars that are able to drive themselves. But it's interesting, this topic also includes AR. So what do we mean by AR, or augmented reality? And so here's a couple of examples. And you can see why they're very tied to each other, right? We have, augmented reality provides the driver with the ability to, recognize not just, the information that's in front of them, gives them additional information, like a cyclist, a pedestrian, and speed limits. And that's all. That used to be based on very simple edge detection techniques, which would identify signs or roads. Now it's complex. It relies on AI that has the capability to process this information, a vast amount of information in real time. So let's see how this creates some issues. So here's a good question, right? We see 3 signs in front of us. Well, what do they all have in common? Well, if you're an AI system for an autonomous vehicle, the answer is they're the same. They all say 45-mile-an-hour speed limit. And there's a study that's probably well known out there that talked about ways you could manipulate signs, like the stop sign and the right turn lane sign here, such that the AI system would say these all mean 45-mile-an-hour speed limit. You could see why that's a problem for a stop sign, or for a right turn when this AI system may be feeding other systems and saying, hey, you need to accelerate now to 45 miles an hour instead of stopping or slowing down to turn right. There's the other issues that and risks that arise with the use of AI and AR, right? As we just talked about in the prior slide with that example, there's hallucinations with AI or adversarial attacks. These are separate, from the internal attacks that Dante and Michelle talked about. And you need to ensure the integrity of AI. So why is this so important? Because, well, you're dealing with a different technology that has different risks associated with it. So regardless of where you are in the AI chain, whether you're a model developer, a service provider, or user of off-the-shelf or maybe customized AI solutions, you need to be aware that these issues exist and prepare for them in your transactions. Be aware of them when you're licensing, when you're talking with service providers, or when you're providing them to companies, and make sure that you're accounting for these in any transactions. And you need to change your approach to due diligence, right? It's more than just kind of kicking the tires, so to speak. You really need to know what's going on behind these AI systems and the models, what they're doing to address these issues, these security concerns, so that if they do get integrated into your system, you're protected against the liability that can arise from them. So having talked about the risks, now let's talk about the protection of IP in this area and how the increased reliance of AI and AR affects that. So the risks that we talked about affect what might be the most valuable innovations in this area, right? General applications of AI have been around for a while, right? The concept of using AI to control a vehicle or to identify, what's in front of you and put it on a display with augmented reality. Those concepts have been around, but the innovations that are likely to be more valuable are the ones that address the risks that we talked about: increased accuracy, security, et cetera. So, and many of these innovations may be better suited for trade secret protection than patent protection. So that will need to change. Moving on to a couple of other items, we've got vehicle connectivity and wireless communication and SEP, standard essential patents. Got the rise of the connected vehicle, and here we have what could be done with some of these SEPs, right? Should we be licensing them? And where in the supply chain should the license attach? Should it be at the OEM level? If you ask Nokia and Avanci, they'll say yes, because they want more money. But does that make sense? Is that the most economic way to do it? It should probably be further up the chain, and that dispute will continue. And then again, who owns the data is going to be a significant question. Then there's other standards emerging too. We talk about wireless standards, but with the rise of EVs, we have the charging standards that are beginning to take hold, and the questions remain. Do companies contribute to IP and obtain the ability to guide these standards, or they sit out? And that's a question that more and more companies are going to have to make. Last couple of items. So battery research and fuel cell EVs. Again, this reflects the significant emphasis on EVs. IP protection, like AI, it's there were a lot of innovations that happened kind of early on, and right now the innovations are going to kind of be on some of the edges, and increasing the efficiency of these EVs. And again, when we're talking about IP risks, there's the rise of the foreign registrant. China has moved quickly on EV technology, and also supply chain, ensuring that up as well. And then the last issue here is the rise in the automotive counterfeit parts from overseas. That's always a concern. How do we stop them? If you're an OEM or a supplier, well, the design patent has always been an effective tool and continues to be, and actually has increased importance in being a tool to be used at the ITC in securing general exclusion orders that prevent these parts from entering the U.S. They're far more reliable in terms of getting general exclusion orders at the ITC. 46% of cases involving design patents secure a general exclusion order versus utility patents. So they've been very strong, very useful in ensuring protection against counterfeit parts or competitors, maybe not even counterfeits. But the strength of these design patents is being tested right now. We're probably all familiar with the LKQ v. GM case. It's up at the federal circuit. We're waiting for a decision there. Oral argument was heard in February 2024, and it may go all the way to the Supreme Court, so stay tuned there. We certainly will. And with that, I'll hand it off to Tom.
Thanks, Mike. By the numbers, China is in a dominant position and increasing role. It's interesting, as preparing for this presentation, I was doing some just interesting updates. I've got some commentator out of Europe. Chinese companies are now increasingly in a position where they could, quote, keep other companies out of business, not just in the automotive supply, but for the whole Internet of Things. Related comment, same person warned that if Chinese companies felt they were not allowed to participate fairly in Western markets, Beijing could decide to use their patents as weapons and curtail Western companies' access to key technologies. These are current quotes. It's interesting where this is going. By the numbers, you could see the numbers speak for themselves. Q1 of this year, 40% of the markets, interesting, has dropped off in China since last year. I imagine that's just an aberration. There's a difference, though, between these granted patents and the way we view patents out of the US. There are qualitative differences that should be considered. Chinese companies tend to file on narrower pieces. It was like the Japanese patent surrounding mentality back from the 80s and 90s. There's a bit of that we see in China right now. So instead of going for the larger bit of technology, they're going for smaller pieces of technology, which is a good strategy because it's going to work. What are their patents, by the way? And you probably all are aware of this. China's has invention patents, utility model patents, has design patents. Utility model have lost its allure because the change in the rules have made them harder to get. They're now being substantively examined. It's a little bit different today than it was before. What is not driving the numbers? And real quick, utility models are not attractive for this purpose. They're designed to protect a new shape, a structural improvement. That's a design patent, even less of a candidate. So really it leaves only invention patents. So what's being patented in China and what is being extended as secondary filing in the US are invention patents for the most part. And they go through substantive examination as utility patents do in the US. And the challenge is, like in the US, like anywhere, the examiners in China are fairly new at this area of technology, and they are capable themselves of being taught. So one of the strategies I always recommend, and I would recommend this even if it wasn't AI technology we're talking about, interview examiners. That may be your practice or your counsel's practice, do that in the US. I certainly hope it is, because that's a very good way of moving a patent forward, keeping your file history very clean, minimize content, the written content. But in China, in my experience for the cases that I've interviewed before the Chinese examiners, it's a surprising number of problems are the result of translation issues. Now you've got that coupled with a learning curve. This is a fairly new technology. This is the time to get broad claim coverage. At the beginning of a technology, when it's more mature, it's going to be harder to get a piece of that pie. So ask for as much as you can, but be prepared to be there or have your counsel be there, your Chinese associate, to explain the technology, what's going on. Take full advantage of the opportunity to meet face to face. I don't have a lot of time, so what I thought I would do is put forward some suggestions about strategies you might take in China, and then we'll get into the rest of it. China, as I said, follow what the Chinese do, basically. File on bits and pieces. There's nothing wrong with that. You're building a portfolio, and eventually you'll be able to have perhaps surround a broader technology that fits within the pieces. Make sure that in your specification, I don't know what your experience has been, but we're seeing a lot of invalidations of foreign patents. Pharmaceuticals especially are experiencing them, trying to work this out, talking with people at US Chamber and USPTO to sort out what's really going on here. But to prevent that, make sure you put in as much detail, perhaps more than you normally think necessary. Don't assume in China, as we do in the US, someone's skilled in the art and what that means. Don't make the mistake, because if you need to prove that in China, it's going to be difficult to show it. Include that in your application in a way that you wouldn't do in the US. that's a good way to make sure that you've got enough information in that application so you can minimize the risk of invalidation, which could be a problem. Where are we looking? The revised examination guidelines and implementing regulations that appeared at the end of last year did help China to advance its skill in terms of being able to protect and patent AI. It provided definitions of what AI was. Technology can be considered patentable when it involves an algorithm having defined relationship with the computer system. Always look for that computer system component. That's the part that you need to move it along. Examiners are being trained to do this, to look for it during examination. Can also be considered patentable where it has been demonstrated ability to solve a technical problem. That's a big open room, right? There's a lot of opportunity to convince someone what can be used to improve, for example, internal performance of that same computing system. Examiners are looking for these, they're looking for the algorithm, they're looking for specific features that US examiners may not be as focused on. And understand that your US portfolio, by the way, doesn't have to be the same as your Chinese portfolio and vice versa. Be prepared to file on different narrow areas. The amendments involved, it's interesting, when these changes are being developed, the amendments to the law involved not only Chinese, the patent office, CNIPA, but also leaders and academics as well to dig into this, to get some clarification. Where else do you look? Chinese government is very aggressive about subsidizing advancement in various technologies. This is one that they're subsidizing clearly. There's a lot of confusion about that. There's a lot of lack of clarity about exactly what the subsidies mean, but there is a substantial investment not only by Chinese automakers, by the government, but also by tech companies and private investors. There's money to be made in AI technology in the auto sector in the world. In China, the auto connectivity, the ability of vehicles to communicate autonomously is seen by Chinese automakers as a critical next step. They're researching this and putting it front and center. You need to step back and remember that the auto industry in China is still fairly new, and they're still experimenting. They're not mature. It's not mature as it is in Europe and the US. They don't have a gas station in every corner. In most of the corners, they don't have anything. And they're going to have an EV charging station there. It's always easier to start fresh than to retrofit. And that mentality is also there when it comes to their next step. The Chinese government, as you can imagine, is very conscious, mindful of security issues as they relate to AI and is watching carefully. We have just a couple of minutes here. There are a number of Chinese automakers, such as Geely and BYD, who were nothing years ago, but have really matured, that are accumulating AI-related patents strategically with an eye toward aggressively licensing. Now, we've seen some of that. For those of you familiar with the CATL debate about opening a battery operation in the US and Michigan, we have seen that attempt to monopolize. And the Chinese have more patents on battery lithium-ion technology than anybody. If CATL does, rather. Huawei has carefully positioned itself to be a leader in AI in their issued patents. And they've invested tremendously in this area. And now they're in a position, Mike mentioned about standard essential patents, the SEPs. They accumulate 65% of the SEPs in this area in 2023. And now they are in a position to aggressively license. So that quote that I read at the beginning of the presentation, that China is in a unique position to be able to control effectively this technology and businesses around the world, that's the reason for it, is because who owns what and who's able to license. That was it in a quick nutshell. And that's all I have. And I think I am out of time. So thank you.